So yeah, if you haven't been with us, we're going through the book of Judges, and we are now at the judge Gideon, and we're taking a little bit more time. It's funny because so part of my process, I like to see what other commentators and other teachers and stuff are teaching. And one of the ones that I came across is there's more written about Gideon than any other judge. And I just at a cursory thought, I went, that can't possibly be true because Samson is a huge judge, and it's true. All of that to say, just because you heard it online by someone who claimed authority doesn't mean that it's true, including from me. So you can always check my work, and the reason that's why I go through the Bible, I want you guys to go through the Bible with me. I want you to read it along with me, and not just take my word for it, but actually challenge the people that are speaking to you and understand that, hey, we're all just human. We're going to make mistakes sometimes. It happens. But if we're not actually going along with it, then we're going to miss it sometimes. And sometimes we'll end up believing things that aren't even in the Bible. And I mean, that kind of stuff has happened all the time. All that to say, let's start at chapter 7, verse 1. And I want to say, because a couple people brought it up, yes, I have been very hard on Gideon. And I think for good reason, okay? But we are going to talk about something here today because and no one's mentioned it to me yet. I was waiting for someone to mention it. No one brought it up, and I was hoping they would, but it's part of the problem with we do these in like 20-minute segments. So if I had 1 hour to teach, I would have already gotten to this part already. But now here we are, and so we're going to talk about why I give Gideon a hard time, but why also the Bible remembers him as a great hero of faith. So, chapter 7, verse 1, it says, early in the morning, so this is right after he does the second sign with the fleece. It says, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all of his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of the Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. Now, we're going to know later on the geographic situation of this is that where the spring is actually kind of up near the top of the valley, and they basically can look down into the valley and see the army. This is important for what's about to happen later on. Okay, so, and then it says, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. And this is what they would say, my own strength has saved me. So instead, now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. So you'll notice we're told he, at the end of chapter 6, that he sent out letters and he recruited people to come and fight for the Lord. We're gonna rise up and we're gonna defend this land that God gave us. And there's two things I want to say about these guys that leave. The first is, it says, if you're afraid, you can leave, right? And so I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, they all left and they were all too scared to fight. No, it's not that they were too scared to fight. They were scared and showed up anyway. I actually want to note, these were actually brave individuals, were they not? They were terrified. They knew that they were going into something. They thought it was certainly going to be doom, and yet they showed up anyways. And then God gave them pardon and said, okay, now you can go. All right, so they did their part. I just don't want to be too hard on them. I know I'm hard on Gideon, but not on them. We'll get to that. But part of that has to do with what God said there, right? I think God's seeing this same pattern, and he understands that not just Gideon, right? He says all of Israel, right? Not you, Gideon. Gideon, you're fine. Gideon, you wouldn't possibly say that your own strength saved me. No, he doesn't say that at all, because he knows that's in Gideon's heart as well. He's a man, right? He's just human like the rest of us. It's certainly a temptation that any of us would have, and I think the pattern of behavior that we've witnessed from Gideon does lend itself toward that. And I think what we're seeing here is a very humbling event. First off, we know from later on in chapter 8 that the army that they're looking down upon is 135,000, okay? And they have 32,000 on the top in their camp. Already the odds aren't looking great, but they're like, but the Lord's with us, and we're worth 4 of every one of them. We could easily take this. So God has to humble them. It says, so then they send off the 22,000, 10,000 remain. I also thought this was interesting. This is very reminiscent of this idea of fear and not going into the land that you were promised, right? Because these were men that they obviously had a lot of fear because their faith wasn't there. And a lot of this has to do with exactly why God said, go into the land and get rid of all the awful worship that was happening to Baal and Asherah and to Moloch and all these other gods, is that now those gods had and that culture had intermingled with their own, polluted their own, and now they no longer had the vigorous faith that they once had in God. It had been watered down and weakened. So their faith was no longer resolute enough for them to be brave enough to go forward. Then verse 4, but I love this, but then the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water. I will thin them out for you there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. Right? So the difference is, do they get a cup of water with their hand? And I don't understand the lap with, because I don't know about you, but I've never gone scoop. Like, I've never done that. I've heard different people explain this differently. They say, oh, it has to do with the sound. Maybe. I don't know. And I've also heard a lot of different, and by the way, the other way was you basically faceplant into the creek. Like, sure. The cupping makes much more sense to me, but as you can see in the story, that is not the popular option. It seems that these guys just want to go face first. And there's a lot that's been said about this. You may hear a lot of different teachers teach a lot of different things. Oh, well, this is symbolizing this and this. Suffice it to say, I don't know how much merit I put in any of that, other than God is using this as a way to say, I want these people, not those people. Right? Fair enough? You can think whatever else you want about the rest. It doesn't say that in the text. We don't know that 100%, but what we do know is God is using this as a way to thin out the herd once again. And boy, does it ever. It says, separate those who lap with their tongues as dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. And then in verse 6, 300 of them drank with cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. So then the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. Okay, they lost roughly 2/3 the first time. So, but you're probably still feeling okay. You got 10,000. But then, 300 from 10,000, what's that? Is that 3%? Is all I had. So 97% just left. I don't know about you, but I'm not feeling good about this at this point. Right? That's terrifying. So Gideon sent the rest, and I think this is on purpose, right? This is a humbling event. It's not meant just to humble Gideon, right? Gideon right here is a placeholder for all of Israel. The attitude that Gideon has is the attitude of Israel. They felt this way about themselves. They felt, and how often do we feel this way about ourselves? We can do it. You know what? I can muster up the strength, and I can do this, and I can, and you know what? God, you're there, but I don't really need you to help me out. We do this all the time. But instead, this time, he's standing up on this hill with 300 men looking down. Can you imagine how terrifying that army would have looked as the night is setting in, and you see all the campfires light up, and you see all the tents and torches of 135,000 soldiers down below you. Now, there's something else about to happen. And again, I don't blame him. I believe the same. But it says, so Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but he kept the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. This is going to be important later. Now, the camp of Midian. See, by the way, that's always something. Whenever it's a weird, odd detail, it's worth paying attention to, right? It's like when we talked about Ehud and it said, and he was left-handed. Yeah, that's going to be important later on, because why else would we talk about it, right? You don't talk about the handedness of someone unless it's important to the story. Unlike today's writing is terrible. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley, and during that night the Lord said to Gideon, get up and go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands. So he'd say, okay, now's the time. We're going to go down in the night. But if you are afraid to attack, right? 300 against 135,000. I get it. Go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Then afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he didn't say, Gideon, go do it. He said, if you're afraid, go do this. So this is going to tell us something about Gideon, where he's at. He was afraid because it starts with, so he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the enemy camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Have any of you ever actually seen a cloud of locusts descend us? So, there's a few movies that have attempted to do it. The new Jurassic World did it. A few other movies have attempted to do it. And there's nothing quite like seeing a cloud of locusts come in, because, quite frankly, in real life, we don't have a resolution that we view the life through. It's just happening. Right? It's one of the things that I noticed about when we lived out west. And we would try and take pictures of the migration of the birds as they were coming, because you just look in the sky and see 1 million birds. You take a picture and you see about 70 of them. And people go, oh, yeah, that's a lot of birds. It's like, no, you have no idea how many birds are in the air. But a camera can't capture all of it. Why do I say all this? Because when it's the same thing when locusts come, right? Movies tend to try and do this thing when you see the cloud coming in. When you see a cloud of locusts coming in, it's the weirdest thing ever. You don't really know what you're looking at. It almost looks like a shadow that moves, and then it stops, and then eats everything, and then the shadow moves on. It's weird. But the reason I want to make sure that I focus on that imagery is because this would have been something that was very common. Everyone would have known. When they said thick as locusts, they would have had this idea of a devouring horde that just moves like a shadow across the earth, devouring as it went. Right? This was a menacing thing. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Right? And as I said, in chapter 8, verse 10, it tells us that there are at least 135,000 soldiers at this point. Verse 13, Gideon arrived. So he goes down with his servant. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling his friend his dream. So he gets to the edge of the camp and he's listening. And he hears someone saying, I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp, and it struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites the whole... And of course, so he's saying the Midianites, so I don't know, is he a Amalekite? Is he another Eastern person? I don't know. But what we do know is he's talking about his own camp. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. So this is what I call decision time and the radical transformation, where we finally see Gideon become a man of faith. And Rebecca, I have it on there as well, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 34. This is the thing that I've been waiting for someone to come up to me and say, now, Pastor, you've been awful hard on Gideon, and in book of Hebrews it says this. Can you put that up there? It's the next one on. And it says this, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, Jep from Duck Dynasty, and about David and Samuel and the prophets, whom through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, and who shut the mouths of lions. So the writer of Hebrews is being pretty explicit. Gideon is in this list of extraordinary men of faith, right? Right alongside David, who we know God loved, right alongside Samson, Barak, who we've already talked about, Samuel, who of course is one of the great prophets. He's got 2 books, and he wrote Judges. But when Gideon, so Gideon has a decision to make. He's gone through all this stuff. He's gone through all this fear, and the Lord said to him, afterward you will be encouraged to attack the camp. And he says, you know what? He hears this dream that is being spoken. He hears the interpretation, and he makes a decision. And it says, when Gideon heard the dream, this is verse 15, when he heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." And suddenly, he becomes a man of valor. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, 100 people each, he places trumpets, and this is the craziest part about this whole battle. He gives them a trumpet and empty jars into their hands of all of them with torches inside. Now, Lauren, maybe you can help me out here. If you're holding a trumpet in one hand, hold up your one hand holding your trumpet, and then you got your clay pot in the other hand, and you hold it up. Now show me, Lauren, how do you grip your sword? So you got some crazy foot dexterity. This is the wildest part about this whole story. Not one of them does it say is wielding a sword, does it? They're holding a trumpet or a shofar, right, the ram's horn, and a clay pot with a torch, and not a weapon. How are they going to kill these guys? Great question. I'm glad you asked. Let's read on. "Watch me," verse 17, he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do." Now, presumably, he gets these instructions from God. It doesn't say that right here, but let's face it. We already seen Gideon be Gideon was warned by God once, and so I assume right here he fell down. He worshipped God. He's saying, "Yes, God, I trust you. I'm going to follow you." And I think right now he's submitted himself under the authority of God, and he's just doing as God is willing to have him do. Verse 18, "When I and all of you who are with me blow our trumpets," so his 100 people, "then from all around the camp, when you guys hear us blow our trumpets, then I want you to blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." And I got a problem with that for Gideon, but we're going to move on because I don't think that that's a necessary thing to tangle up on today. Verse 19, "Then Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch." So it's shift change. And then just after they changed the guard, they, the ones with Gideon, blew their trumpets, broke their jars that were in their hands. So you can imagine, you hear suddenly 100 trumpets blast and then shattering glass all around you. It's got to be scary. However, there's still 200 other guys that haven't done anything yet. Then the three companies, the rest of them, blew their trumpets and smashed their jars, grasping their torches. Then all of a sudden there's a torch up in the air. All these lights suddenly show up. In their right hands and their trumpets they were to blow, and they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And while each man held his position around the camp, they're standing there. All of the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. And it gets even better. And then when the 300 trumpets sounded, right, so it says the 100 sounded, then they broke their jars, they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," and then they blast their horns. And then what happens? It says, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. You don't need a sword if you can somehow convince your enemy to turn on itself. Then it says the army fled to Beth Shittah toward Zerah as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah." So what we remember from the end of chapter 6 is this army had already come from the east, crossed over the Jordan, and they were down in the core of Israel. Right? They were out near, if you remember where Ephraim is, it's on the other side of the mountain range. So Gideon shows up, he horns blast, they start killing each other, they're running around, fleeing, they're trying to get out of there. Where are they trying to get to? They're trying to get out, right? The Lord is showing up. Stuff's happening, and they need to get out. And so what does Gideon say? He says, "Go seize the waters of the Jordan to the east as far as Beth Barah." Now, you may say, where is that? All that's important for you to know is they seized a huge strip of the Jordan River. Why is that important? There's two things. Number one, if you're moving an army, you have to move an army from water to water because otherwise you're going to die of thirst. The other thing is they live on the east side of the Jordan River. So if they're going to retreat, they're going to try and get across the Jordan River. So first off, we know they're headed to water. And second, we know that water is going to be the Jordan because they need to try and get home. So they're trying to get out of there. And what do they find when they get there? The men of Ephraim waiting for them. And here's the other thing that we learned from the story of Barak. What happens when you're running for your life and suddenly you arrive at your destination? You're a bit parched, right? You're in need of a drink. They're probably running to that Jordan thinking, okay, I'll get there, I'll get some fresh water, I'll be refreshed, and I can be renewed, and then if the enemy catches up with us, we'll be ready. And then, of course, can you imagine their surprise when they arrive, and instead their enemy, the nation of Israel, is waiting for them. So it says, so all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. And they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. So that is the battle. And it's incredible. See, you get similar notions to what happened at the Battle of Jericho, don't you? Battle of Jericho was fought by God and won by God. Right? They blasted the trumpets, the walls came down, but it had nothing to do with anything they did. It was about their faith in God acting out once they were able to believe, once they were able to trust and do as he said. Could you imagine today being told, you go around this army of 135,000. You imagine if your commanding officer came to you and said, okay, now when you get there, don't bring your sword. It's just going to weigh you down. And besides, you're just going to stand there anyway. But when you get there, I want you to smash your clay pot and blow on your trumpet. It doesn't sound like a winning strategy. But this is where trust in the Lord takes over. When God asks you to do it, you have to trust that he's got a bigger plan. And sure enough, he does. He shows up. He causes that confusion. He causes that disturbance. And then the enemy ends up turning on itself. The other reason why I was really excited to get to this part is because we finally see a transformation of Gideon from this guy that I don't think is that admirable to suddenly being someone mighty of faith. Finally recognizes the authority and power of God. And suddenly become someone that we're going to read about 3,000 years later. The story we share still today. And why do I think that's so important? I think it's so important because that's who we are. We're not special. We're not, we're not better. Like often, we've talked about this before, we oftentimes think we're better than we are. But the point is that God can take anyone. If God can take Gideon and suddenly turn him into a mighty hero of faith, then it has absolutely nothing to do with any of your skill, any of your ability, any of your prowess. It has everything to do with what God is willing to do. And here's the other thing too, is a lot of the times, like we only know about so many things in the Bible because there's only so much space to write stuff down. And there's going to be a lot of things that God's going to call us to that will never be recorded, that will never probably mention, never cross anyone else's lips, that no one will ever know. But God will know. And when we're standing before him in judgment, do you want him to compare you to Gideon pre-battle or Gideon, I'm going to say during the battle, because we're going to get into the rest of the life of Gideon later on. And it's why it's important to continue to pursue this.